Yet for all their service in peace, in war they too became victims. In the 1920s and 30s, the Atlantic Greyhounds returned to the ocean as glorious hotels and ships of state. And when a new war presents greater and more difficult problems on the Atlantic battlefield, it will inspire the great ships to serve their finest hour. Some will become legends in their time. This, then, is the continuing story of the great floating palaces of the North Atlantic. QE2 is in mid-ocean, eastbound from New York to her home port of Southampton. It has taken her 3 days and 1,300 tons of diesel fuel to come 1,500 miles. Back in those early days when Samuel Cunard's first ships began service across the Atlantic, the crossing took 16 days, if the weather was good. Throughout the QE2, the historic traditions of the Cunard Company are everywhere. On display are posters and paintings that recount the Cunard history, from hauling the mail to moving passengers, from wood and sail to iron and steam. Here also is the Silver Boston Cup presented to Samuel Cunard by a grateful city after his early ships linked Boston to Britain. For Cunard, crossing the Atlantic was a good business. As he said to his partners, "We have no roads to build, no tracks to lay. All we need do is load our ships full and steer a course across the wide ocean." True as that may have been in 1840, 100 years later, a Second World War would turn the floating palaces into the prey of a vaunted enemy. It is 1939. Germany prepares for war. Adolf Hitler defies the international prohibition against building a navy and uses Germany's liners to deceive the world. He claims the new fleet will reward industrious factory workers with pleasure cruises. He calls the disguised rearmament program Strength Through Joy. In truth, his new liners will hunt Allied ships. Hitler continues his pattern of deception. Britain is wary. On the very day Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returns to England with Hitler's promise for peace, the Queen Elizabeth is launched at Clydebank. She will be Cunard's newest liner, sister ship to the Queen Mary, and the largest ship in the world, 11 feet longer than her predecessor. Although built for luxury, she is secretly readied for war. And war does come. Like the Vaterland a generation before, the German superliner Bremen is trapped in New York. British cruisers wait just beyond the horizon. Under the shroud of a moonless night, the Bremen makes a daring run to sea. Steaming at full speed, she outruns the British warships and heads for the neutral port of Murmansk in Russia. As she races for safety, the crew paints the entire ship battle gray from scaffolding flung over the side. Drums of diesel fuel line her deck. If the Bremen is captured, Hitler has ordered the crew to set her ablaze. But she escapes. She arrives in Murmansk, and goes on to a triumphant welcome in Bremerhaven. At last she is safe at home, only to be set afire and destroyed by Germans opposed to Hitler. In March 1940, the Queen Elizabeth is prepared for her maiden voyage. Secrecy surrounds her sailing.
These big posters are all over the ports of Great Britain about keeping secret. You couldn't say anything about ship movements whatsoever. On pain of death, you're arrested. And there's 3 cases I know where people were shot for that. Of loose talk, they call it, especially in pubs. There were spies here, and that information could get to the enemy.
As so many Cunarders before her, she will call on Southampton and then leave for New York. The Luftwaffe dispatches bombers. They arrive high over Southampton, ready to sink her on sight. But once at sea, the captain opens his sealed orders to find a change of plans. The Queen Elizabeth, dressed in battle grey, her portholes painted black, will steam at full speed on a zigzag course for New York. There has been no time for a shakedown cruise. Her engines were tested in the Clyde, running one full forward, the other in reverse. Now it is to be a test of engineering, labor, and luck. New York is 5 dangerous days ahead. The New York Press Corps learns of her flight. They charter planes to search for her in the dense fog. When she finally appears, she is flying the Stars and Stripes in bold salute. After an incredible voyage during which she has eluded German bombers, U-boats, and surface raiders, the Queen Elizabeth takes her place at a Hudson River pier, alongside the Queen Mary and the Normandy, to prepare for her new life as a troop carrier. A year later, when France falls, the Germans will make a futile claim that the Normandy belongs to them, a prize of war. But for now, she is safe, as another peaceful era comes to an end. 2 weeks later, the Queen Mary begins her wartime service. In 6 months, the Queen Elizabeth joins her. They are now the largest troop ships in the world. Their service will change the outcome of the war. In Germany, Hitler offers a bounty of $250,000 for the destruction of either ship.
There was a danger from the German submarines, but also the fast ships were on the safe side because they were very fast. The Queen Mary was one time, maybe twice on the target, but they were too fast. They could escape to the submarines. It was the speed of the ships.
The Queens steam to Australia and New Zealand. They will carry over 30,000 men from down under to the war in Europe and North Africa, if they can stay afloat. Inside, once stately rooms are now a soldier's humble quarters. The 17,000 men on board must eat and sleep in shifts. The floating palaces have become floating barracks. It is 1942. Now that America is in the war, the Normandy is renamed Lafayette. Her art is removed. Her conversion to a troop ship begins. But a welder's errant spark ignites a shipment of life jackets delivered ahead of schedule. The highly flammable jackets become Normandy's funeral pyre. The greatest ship of the age, this winner of the Blue Riband, this elegant ship of state, is consumed in the madness of war.
I rushed over to see her, and I saw Captain Adolphus Andrews in charge, doing nothing whatsoever, and learned later all sorts of awful things that he should have done. He refused to accept, for example, the help of the man who designed the Normandy, Vladimir Yarkovich. He came up and offered to help. He said, I know the ship inside and out. I can open the seacocks and she'll sink 6 inches and be perfectly safe. And he said, this is a Navy job.
For 2 years, we all came over and watched the raising of the Normandy, inch by inch, foot by foot, and this tremendous whale, this dead carcass was there, filling the entire space between the ship here and the pier there. And the saddest thing that you can imagine, here was the glory of all ships ever built, desolate and finished.
Normandy has been in service for only 4 years. Her interiors were among the most beautiful creations ever fashioned, a contemporary museum of French art. Now the beautiful Normandy will be raised and sold as scrap. Throughout the war, the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary never rest. They will deliver 1.5 million men to battle. As the war rages on, one of the most beautiful liners will be blown to bits. Another is involved in one of the most tragic actions of the war. At her launch in 1934, the Queen Mary was the world's largest ship. 10 million rivets hold her hull together, 151 watertight compartments, her enormous rudder alone weighing 140 tons, 10 anchors, and 990 feet of anchor chain make up her overall weight of 81,000 tons, more than Cunard's entire fleet in 1876. In her day, she'd set the Atlantic speed record at 31.6 knots. But in 1940, Britain is at war, and the Queen Mary is the largest troop ship of all time. October 2nd, 1942, the Queen Mary arrives off the Irish coast, just miles away from Greenock, Scotland. Traveling at top speed on her usual zigzag course, she is full of troops. His Majesty's ship Curaçao is dispatched as her escort. 22-year-old Jeff Carter is the ship's wireless telegraph operator. John Hendricks is a 19-year-old American soldier on the Queen Mary. A submarine alert is sounded. The Queen goes on standby. Then begins one of the most extraordinary events in the career of any liner.
It's absolutely absurd that this accident ever happened. The Queen Mary was zigzagging. They had changed course every 6 to 9 minutes to keep the subs from being able to get their sights on us. The day we were supposed to arrive in Greenock, Scotland, they sent this Curaçao out to escort us in, probably for a half hour. I sat there and watched it as it came up alongside the Queen Mary.
It was getting larger and larger, but unfortunately heading our way. Now, my knowledge, our zigzag should cause us to cross her stern, but somehow we seemed to be heading for her bows. As I stood there, the Queen Mary just got larger and larger, until eventually it dawned on me that there was no way we were going to get out of the way of her.
I knew we were going to hit, and then I felt just a slight shudder.
You could see very little for clouds of steam, voices, people running about. And I could see the stern floating away. The Queen Mary had cut us in two.
And about that time, I saw the stern of the Curaçao, a prop and the rudder sticking up out of the water, and it was floating back alongside the Queen Mary. Then I heard commotion over on the other side. I ran over there, and the bow was coming down that side. And then it bobbed a little and settled down just about deck level, steam boiling out of it, and then down it went, and it took everything around it. Everything that you could see in the water around it just went right on down there.
The Kurosawa sinks within 3 minutes. According to official reports, all but 99 of her 430 crewmen are drowned. But the Queen Mary is under orders not to stop. She cannot slow, even to lower a lifeboat.
We understand now, of course, that she had orders that under no circumstances had she to stop.
The other ships around came in and picked up the survivors.
We were taken on board the destroyer, and I remember very little after that, other than two things that really stuck in my mind. Was the number of bodies lined up on the deck, and others that were on mess tables down below, choking to death with oil.
On her return to the United States, the Queen Mary puts into Boston for repairs. The tragedy remains a secret until the end of the war. When the Queen Mary returns to the Atlantic, she will set the record for the largest transport of troops in a single crossing, 16,683. The war has taken a heavy toll on the ships of Britain's lifeline. 3,557 merchant vessels will be at the bottom before it's over. And many of the floating palaces that once graced the seas are part of the kill. Already gone are the Bremen and the Normandy, both glorious ships, both holders of the Atlantic speed record. Next will be the pride of the Italian fleet, the first superliner to hold the Hales Trophy, the Elegant Rex. It is September 1944. The German army is on the verge of collapse. Fearing an Allied landing in Trieste, the SS has seized the Italian liner and will sink her to block the harbor. The British are determined to stop them. Dennis Andrews was a navigator in the Royal Air Force. He was part of that deadly mission.
I was on 39th Squadron in the RAF, flying this sort of aircraft. These are Beaufighters, two crew aircraft, with the pilot sitting in the cockpit at the front, and the navigator, I was a navigator, sitting in the cupola at the back. And they were armed with rockets mounted under the wings here. You can see them on this model. And those are particularly suitable for anti-shipping because they would go through the sides of a ship and make considerable holes.
Ralph Elliott was a Beaufighter pilot.
I was a pilot on 39 Squadron flying rocket Beaufighters on ground attack and anti-shipping patrol.
On Friday, the 8th of September, we were up pretty early on standby for the Italian liner Rex, 51,000 tons, which was reputed to be somewhere near Trieste. This standby didn't amuse us very much, as we had pretty definite views as to the amount of flak likely to be around a target of that size. Then suddenly, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there was panic. And by 5 o'clock we were airborne, beating up the Adriatic. We crossed the southeast coast of Istria, and we flew at treetop height, as we always did in these aircraft. It was our best defense. There was, in fact, some machine gun fire with tracer when we were partway across, but no hits were scored on us, fortunately. We saw Capodistria, with Trieste beyond, and in between, in the inlet, we could see our target, which was the Rex.
Another squadron attacked her first, but as they didn't actually sink her, we were asked to go in for a second attack later on in the day, in the evening that day.
She was already, by this time, listening to ports with smoke curling up from one side. We had an escort of 4 Mustangs, and their purpose really was to damp down any anti-aircraft fire. But in fact, there was none from the ship at all, contrary to our expectations. And we then went in, 6 of our Beaufighters and 2 Beaufighters of a South African squadron. I saw the backbursts from the rockets from under the wings here as the rockets were released and fired. Then we hit through clouds of smoke coming up from the target, of course, at this time. And as we curved away over the target, from my position at the back, I then had a full view of the Rex. And I could see that by this time, smoke was pouring from her full length, and she was almost over on her side, in fact. It was 64 hits, every one a winner. Now we were weaving viciously because there were a lot of puffs of black smoke around, which were heavy ack-ack from the Trieste anti-aircraft guns. There was intense fire at this time, and it was uncomfortably close. But my pilot's evasive action was superb, so much so that it tossed me out of my seat once or twice. In between, I did get 2 or 3 good photographs. And so we went back to base, knowing that the Rex was quite definitely sunk. And en route, I had to send a wireless telegraphy message, so I sent, in Morse of course, the message Rex Finito.
All 6 aircraft returned safely, and amazingly enough, with not a scratch on them, because we'd rather anticipated it would be an extremely dicey operation, that the Rex would be heavily defended. Later, of course, the photographs were produced and would confirm or otherwise with the pilot's impression of what had happened at the time.
It always seems a shame to have to sink anything like that. You have to be prepared to attack whatever target the senior officers set up for you. And so it wasn't up to us to say, well, that's too beautiful a ship to sink.
In 8 months, the war in Europe will be over. But for most of the floating palaces, it is already too late. Hitler orders the scuttling of the Europa, but the plan is not carried out, and she is captured at Bremerhaven and handed over to the French, who rename her Liberté. The Conte di Savoia is also sunk, never to sail again. But the Queens Mary and Elizabeth survive and are restored to the floating palaces they once were. Winston Churchill credits the troop-carrying Queens with shortening the war by a year or more. When peace returns, the Queens will still have one more wartime assignment. They will carry an historic cargo to America. And off the coast of Nantucket a decade later, tragedy will strike at sea once again. And this time, the world will watch. Ocean liners have crossed the Atlantic since the turn of the century. They've carried immigrants and millionaires, mail and war supplies. But in 1946, the Queens Mary and Elizabeth will carry a very special cargo. They are the war brides. Over 1 million of them sailed for America in the years immediately following the war. Years later, some returned to the Queen Mary in Long Beach. It was the largest westbound migration on the sea since 1911. The visit unlocks a tide of memories.
War had been going on for 6 years. I'd been married 14 months. We'd always dreamed about the war ending, but you know, when it actually did, it was something of a shock, and we just, all of a sudden I realized that I would be leaving home, I'd be leaving England, and it was an emotional time. I had mixed emotions about that.
We came under a act that was passed by Mr. Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, 1945, and it lasted till 1948. That brought all us war brides over under the United States Government Act.
I can remember driving up at the dock at Southampton, and all I saw was this huge grey wall. It was like a building, and but I did see a gangplank. We saw what looked like a gangplank. It was on ground level, and instead of windows like a building, I looked up and there were these round portholes. 1 row, 2 row, and I was like this until I got to 12 rows of portholes. And then we realized that this was a gargantuan ship, but we didn't know what ship. It was just awe-inspiring. And so the girls began calling out, what ship is this? You know, nobody would tell us. And then an old Cockney guy who was taking care of some luggage on the deck, he said, don't you know what this ship is? He says, "You're going on the Queen Mary."
The Queens Mary and Elizabeth are packed with war brides and with their children. It's called Operation Baby Carriage.
Eleanor Roosevelt told some of the war brides that they might be going to the United States on the Queen Mary. And then I thought, oh dear, no, not me. This could never happen.
Nobody had gone on the Queen Mary but the rich and famous.
I wanted to be on her. I wanted to be on the Queen Mary. She was gorgeous.
We were the first party of war brides after the ship was turned over from a troop ship. There were some businessmen on board, and some of them took care of the children because so many mothers were seasick.
It was a wonderful feeling with all us women together. We were going to a new country. We were all in the same boat. I mean, we were all, there goes that Irish humor. We were all coming to America, you know.
And there was the Statue of Liberty in the distance, and the tugboats in New York Harbor were on strike. And so there was one man, he was part of one of the government officials. He happened to be a passenger on board, and he sent a wire to President Truman to allow, to provide safety for the Queen to come in, because she had to have these tugs. So President Truman got, I think it was 8 or 9 Army tugboats. And there were whistles, and there were what they call autogyros in those days, which were really helicopters, as we call them now. And every porthole, every rail, every place on the Queen Mary was filled with girls. That was a most exciting entrance.
The end of the war marks the beginning of America's entry into the superliner competition. But just as with the American-built Savannah, that first steamship to cross the Atlantic, the SS United States is an ill-timed venture.
After the Second World War, the United States government realized, with WW3 looming in the distant clouds, that the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth had been such valuable troop transports. Well, perhaps we need a troop transport of our own. And a little down the road, maybe we should be carrying the national flag on the commercial run to Europe. And so, under the Truman administration, they underwrote $80 million to build America's first superliner, the world's most technologically advanced ocean liner.
She is designed by William Gibbs, America's best-known naval architect, famous for his conversion of the Vaterland to the American Leviathan after World War I. The United States is launched into a new era in a new way. There is no dramatic slide into the river, no royalty, no great wave to soak the spectators. She is simply floated out of her dry dock at Newport News. She is the fastest ship the world has ever seen. Her top speed is an incredible 43 knots. On her maiden voyage, she captures the speed record and becomes the last passenger liner to hold the Hales Trophy.
3.5 days to Europe, 43 knots for a little while on her trials, 20 knots in reverse. Futuristic-looking 2 huge smokestacks, so sophisticated in things like fire safety. Everything was treated. She had a double engine room in case she should be torpedoed if she ever were a troop ship. A double piping, double electrical system. The Pentagon, which was paying most of the bill, said, we might need this ship one day to carry 15,000 plus soldiers. Her idea as a liner was more secondary. Fortunately, she sailed for all of her life as a commercial ship. She never saw war duties. Unfortunately, her career ended in 1969, all too quickly. She was, by then, a big Cadillac, consuming lots of fuel, costing a lot of money. The jets had arrived, her numbers were coming down, and so very abruptly, one November night, she sailed out of New York Harbor with no ceremony, never to return, and endured a layup in Norfolk. That was longer than all the years she actually sailed.
When Americans were the first to steam across the Atlantic, they were too early. Now, when they are the best, they are too late. Today, the SS United States is remembered at the American Merchant Marine Museum in Kings Point, Long Island. The contents of her modern fireproof interiors were sold at auction, and the great ship was mothballed. She was sold in 1980 and again in 1992. Her current owner first saw the ship as a passenger.
I emigrated to this country back in 1963, and I had a choice to take, I think, a DC-6 at the time or the SS United States, and I chose the latter. And it was an experience. It was some experience. It is an offshore liner that has no second. If you look at it from an airplane, as we did, it's like an arrow. It pierces through the water. It can go up to 42 knots. There's no other vessel that can go at 42 knots and carry 2,000 passengers.
The end story is she's sitting in Turkey waiting for a resurrection as a tropical cruise ship. Will it happen? We'd like to think so. We hope so. We're nostalgic. But will the monies come in to convert a 990-foot-long liner that would cost $250 million when she's 40 years old to rebuild for cruising? Stay tuned.
The North Atlantic has long been a stern master, but disaster at sea haunts every crossing. But the most recent tragedy is different than the Lusitania or Titanic, because this time, people watched the ship go down on television. On Wednesday, July 25th, 1956, the Italian luxury liner Andrea Doria approaches New York after an uneventful voyage from Italy. Near the coast of Nantucket, she crosses paths with another ship, the Stockholm. How these two, well within sight of each other, fail to avoid the ensuing tragedy is a mystery that remains unanswered.
We had been vacationing through Europe at all resorts. We were in Venice and we were in Capri, and we thought this was a fitting ending to a wonderful trip.
The reinforced bow of the icebreaker Stockholm slams into the side of the Andrea Doria.
After dinner, we went up to the Belvedere Lounge for cocktails or a farewell drink. And we were sitting there, and we had a loud crash. And all of a sudden, the bottles started sliding off the bar. We saw people coming up with life vests on. We couldn't stand. We had to hold on to the posts of the promenade deck because the ship was listing very badly. Mrs. Carlin was in her bed reading a book. Colonel Carlin was at the sink. When the crash came, their room was hit. And when the ship separated, Mrs. Carlin was sucked out into the ocean, and he was able to see her washed away, but was helpless to do anything because she was gone before he could even catch his breath. It was such a ridiculous accident. There was no reason for it. It should not have happened.
Because she is near land, the casualties are limited to 52. The Ile-de-France is among the rescuing vessels.
The most beautiful sight I ever saw was the name Ile-de-France in lights. And I had told my husband the night before that I wanted to travel on the Ile-de-France on my next trip. Little did I know I would be there the next day. But it's true. That's how it happened.
The great floating palaces of the North Atlantic have survived disaster and war, but it is the undeterred march of progress that will finally seal their fate. October 26th, 1957, the first commercial airliner arrives in London, non-stop from New York. It will accomplish what acts of God, Atlantic gales, negligence at sea, and 2 world wars could not. It will end the era of the floating palaces.
I was in the Queen Mary at the time, and we were full of passengers. And then we heard that a passenger-carrying plane had crossed from New York to London, and from that moment onwards, the great North Atlantic liners began to decline. The ships just disappeared, like a friend that had been hit by a truck. We never had time to say goodbye to them. They just went.
Within a decade, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth are retired. Captain Michael Dodds was in charge of the official send-off for the Mary.
I arranged this party on the tug, and we all went down the river singing, drinking, and laughing, and we shouldn't have been laughing. We should have been weeping.
The Queen Mary sails for Long Beach, California, where her new owners plan to use her as a convention center. The last voyage is sold out. Tom Witherspoon was on the bridge when she arrived.
They shut down the steam, they shut down the boilers. Then everybody, I guess, just took a big sigh. I don't know which one it was, whether it was an officer or a rated man. Said, well, mates, that's the end for the Mary.
The Queen Elizabeth is sold to a Chinese millionaire who intends to turn her into a floating university. Instead, she burns in Hong Kong harbor. Her demise appears to be the work of an arson. Rumors persist that the alleged culprit is the son of the owner, angered that his father chose to buy the ship instead of setting the money aside as an inheritance.
My life, 50 years of my life was on. My name was notched on that boat somewhere. Cried and laughed on that ship, you know, and she went down in Hong Kong harbor. Unbelievable.
Now the only liner on the North Atlantic is the QE2. Today she arrives in Southampton after her 999th crossing in 4 days, 21 hours, and 37 minutes. Man's conquest of the Atlantic was once a dream. In the last 150 years, it became a reality. Like the first Cunard ship, Britannia, the QE2 is alone. But then, Britannia marked the beginning of an era. QE2 seems to be at the end of one. Charles Dickens made Cunard a household name in 1840 by describing the dangers of his crossing and calling his cabin a hearse with windows. What would he have thought of this exclusive penthouse high up on the QE2? The only thing the same is that wine is not included in the fare. Unlike those early days of crossing by steam, there has been no fear or frustration on this voyage, no boredom or bravery. This crossing has been routine, comfortable, and luxurious. Safety has been taken for granted. QE2 arrives at a Southampton much different from that of the glory years. There are no other liners awaiting space at these docks. But QE2 is not entirely alone here, but the business has changed. Crossings are few, cruisings are many. In fact, more cruise ships are underway and under construction than at the industry's former peak in 1907. Jets have taken over the business of getting there, but ships retain the business of going in style, even if it means going nowhere. Extraordinary as these ships are, they can never hope to imitate the Normandy, Bremen, or Mauretania. Cruise ships do parade a kind of elegance, yet even their owners will tell you they are no match for those palaces of another era. What has endured from the great liners can be seen in places like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Here is Dupas' masterwork in glass, The Rape of Europa, from the Normandy. Private collectors have spent small fortunes to own treasured pieces of this remarkable past. In Manhattan, Mario Pellucci shows off a piece from the same masterwork.
This one has a really amazing figure in it. It's just total fantasy. Nothing really was practical on the Normandy. Everything was exaggerated, everything was over the top, and it was frivolous. If the ship had a soul, that would be what it was about, just about total abandon and just extravagance.
In San Francisco, John Mayotel boasts one of the most extensive private collections from the Normandy in the world.
I have a collection that extends from postage stamps to furniture, just about every kind of artifact you can think of in connection with ocean liners, except perhaps the liner itself. You sit in a chair from the Normandy, it well may be that Fred Astaire or Marlene Dietrich may have been in that same chair. Probably the most evocative piece that I have is a gold-plated brass replica of the doors that led to the dining room from a great hall of the Normandy. The doors were apparently scrapped, and someone retrieved them, and they're on a church in Brooklyn Heights, and you can go and see them.
Those ships and the world in which they sailed are gone now. Gone with them is the vitality that energized many a shipyard and home port. In Glasgow, the Scots still build ships, but in far fewer numbers. In Liverpool, a stoker's monument honors the men who drove the engines of the Titanic until the ship went down, and they with it. But no one can tell the story firsthand. In Germany, the Hapag Hall at Cuxhaven is empty. No immigrants wait for the next ship to Ellis Island. Germany's great liners changed the world. Now their rightful place is in history at the National Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven. In Cunard's latter-day home of Southampton, the passenger docks are empty. Images of the past still haunt the present. Bits and pieces of a bygone time fascinate us still. What must it have been like to sail the ocean in a floating palace? At an historic Southampton pub, where life on the sea was once talked about in the present, memories of the past are rekindled once again.
To all those who served under Queen Mary, and to the Queen Mary herself.
And the Queen Elizabeth.
And the Queen Elizabeth.
Good. And the Queen. Yes. Cheers. Cheers. And Bing looked at her and he started singing, "Where are you?" You know, and she's all blushed up.
It's difficult to explain. It sounds silly when you think of a ship as a living thing, but it does develop that sort of personality.
We had the Duke and Duchess of Windsor on board, and they had 42 pieces of baggage.
And across in that summer afternoon was the sound of the ship's band playing on the top deck of the Bremen.
Yeah.
And it's something that I've never forgotten.
Everybody used to dress for dinner in those days. You know, the dining room was a wonderful sight at dinner time, with up to about 700 or 800 people there, all in evening dress. It was beautiful.
You could go on deck at night, and the stars always seemed so much bigger than they do ashore. And there was no land in sight, just this lovely sense of peace and the throb of the engines and the waves lapping against the ship. I don't know really how to express it in words.
Perhaps the moon and stars will never shine as brightly as when they lit the way for those great ships that once bridled the harsh Atlantic. Indeed, they were but the creations of man. Yet somehow they became more. They were the embodiment of an age that will never come again. Those great ships of state, the floating palaces of the North Atlantic.